Let's begin with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, we have been listening all week to Matthew's ideas for us regarding how do you live in a community that is having difficulties, suffering from distress. We could ask the same thing to different Gospels, Mark, Luke, John. And they'd all give us some different insights because all those communities are different and they have different situations, different settings. But we're just focusing on one, on Matthew, and asking him what advice he could give us. I'm suggesting that he rattled off 10 points right away. Here's some things you can do. We saw the first one was recall your roots, which basically means know your history, know where you've come from, then you'll know where you're supposed to be going. We saw how he did that with that genealogy. And yesterday we had one, delay gratification, which actually was leading us to the section in the head of the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, the blessed ones. The interesting thing about the Beatitudes and why Matthew would have said delay gratification is because all the Beatitudes start out with situations of diminishment, which sounds odd to us. Blessed are you when you don't have this and when you don't have that and when that's not working. And so, how on earth could that be? Well, because after a while, that'll be turned around. When the fullness of the kingdom of God begins to show what it's all about, then those states of diminishment are going to be states of fulfillment. Blessed are the poor in spirit, those people who know they need help, because theirs will be the kingdom of heaven. There were 8 of those. Today, there's a couple of suggestions. One, the third item here, deepen your faith. Matthew chapter 8, verses 23, 27. It's not a very long passage, but it's an interesting little scenario. We don't know where Matthew found this piece. It's told about Jesus, but he inserted it here. And when Jesus got into the boat, his disciples followed him. A windstorm arose on the sea, so great that the boat was being swamped by the waves. But he was asleep. And they went and woke him up and said, Lord, save us, we're perishing. And he said to them, why are you afraid, you of little faith? And he got up, rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a dead calm. They were amazed, saying, what sort of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him? Good question. What kind of a man, what kind of a person is this? Well, in Matthew's community, when they would have heard this story, there were certain things they would have been able to plug into. Some of us are not that familiar with. The idea of the church as a boat. That was pretty popular back in the time of Matthew when they would start depicting what the church is like. Those people who did icons and artistic work oftentimes would show the church in the form of a little boat, and that little boat would be on this huge sea, and it would look as if that sea is just about ready to swallow up that little boat. And that was because for the people, the Christians in that community, that's what it felt like. And if we would think about that image a little bit longer, we'd begin to see it's not a bad image, because sometimes being in the community appears like it's about ready to sink. And we're swamped, we don't know how it's going to. Everybody's had that kind of experience. But so far, and this would be their point, we're still afloat. Notice the way Jesus is depicted here. It's kind of an interesting contrast. A windstorm arose on the sea, so great that the boat was being swamped by the waves, but he was asleep. Really? How do you sleep through a storm? Well, it depends on who you are, apparently. You and I, we probably wouldn't sleep through a storm. But Jesus, he's not a bit worried, apparently. And they went and woke him up and saying, "Lord, save us. We are perishing." Apparently, he doesn't think that's the case. They do. And that might be our situation too. Sometimes we feel like the whole thing's about to perish, but really it isn't. Really it isn't. And he said to them, "Why are you afraid?" If you underlined in your good book, that would be one of the places I'd tell you to underline and to come back to that question. Why are you afraid, you of little faith? Well, we're afraid because we think we're sinking. Well, why do you think you're sinking? Well, because it feels like we're sinking. It looks like we're sinking. Everything else we've seen like this, it's sunk. Yes, but this is not everything that you've seen before. This is something unique. What about your faith? You of little faith. Then he got up, rebuked the winds and the sea. There was a dead calm. Remember, in the Old Testament, one of the aspects about God in the stories of creation is that God had the power to take chaos and turn it into order. That's what creation was about. Taking chaos, shaping it, forming it into order. And oftentimes the chaos would be depicted as an ocean that was just out of control. And in that ocean would be all kinds of huge sea monsters. And God, by merely speaking, would conquer them all. That was the understanding of what God could do. God, in God's creative power and ability, can take the worst of situations, the worst of chaos, and shape it into order. If Jesus is the Son of God, then what Matthew is suggesting is, he can do the same thing. He can do the same thing. He can take chaos and shape it into order. And this would be an example. He knows what he's going to do. He knows how he's going to do it. But his disciples don't. And so they are panicking. So the question that this brings to us, of course, is what about our little faith? How does that work? Here's a story that goes along with that, kind of. I don't have it listed, that's all right. We know one of the teachings of that storm being calm is that as long as Jesus is in the boat, we're safe. As long as Jesus is in the boat, we're safe. No matter how chaotic it appears, if he is in the boat, we're safe. Translated into more contemporary terms, as long as Jesus is present in the church is all right. The church will be fine as long as he is present here in it, and that we can be aware of his presence. That with even our little faith, we are able to detect that we will be all right because he is here present. And he can be here present in a multitude of ways, through other people, through situations. And we have to be able to read those situations through our little faith. Being in the boat, Jesus in the boat, present in the boat, we're okay. Now here's another story. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and to go on ahead to the other side. Many of these storms, these guys are not going to want to get in that boat, but so far it seems okay. Well, he dismissed the crowd. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. In Matthew's gospel, as well as Luke, anytime Jesus is about to undergo an important event, he will take time out, go off by himself, and pray. The Bible, the New Testament, doesn't have any theory of prayer, theology of prayer, philosophy of prayer. It just shows us Jesus praying. And every time he's getting ready for a major event of some kind, he always takes some time off, goes away, and prays. And that's the case here. He went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by the time the boat, battered by the waves, the church, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning, he came walking toward them on the sea. So he's walking toward them on the sea. He's walking on the water. Para is the Greek word, preposition on, beside, something like that. Most people think this is the point of the story. Jesus can walk on water. If Jesus can walk on water, some would say that must mean he's God, because we can't walk on water. He can. That's what this story's about. Jesus is God because he can walk on water. And if we told that to Matthew, he'd just laugh and say, close and no cigar at all. You didn't miss it. You didn't make it at all. Early in the morning, he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, as we would be. They were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." They cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." That's the point of the story. That's where the revelation comes. The revelation of Jesus as God does not come because he can walk on water, and we assume that only people who are divine can walk on water. The point is, he reveals who he is to his disciples by telling them, "It is I." Now, how would you know that? Well, sorry to say, you probably wouldn't, unless you could read Greek. And there's only probably a few of us that can do that. It is I. When God revealed himself to Moses on Mount Sinai, there was a big discussion back and forth. Moses kept wanting to know God's name. God kept saying, "I'm not telling you my name. You don't need to know it. Just tell the people you know. I am who I am. I'll be around as I'll be around." That's sort of like that. I'm not giving you a name. Well, if you don't give me a name, they won't believe that you're here. Well, I don't care. I am who I am. Eya Esher Eya, Hebrew. When the Bible was translated into Greek, that Hebrew phrase was translated as ego eimi. I am. And when Jesus wants to reveal who he is in terms of he is the Son of God, oftentimes he will use an I am saying. The Gospel of John is full of them. I am the Good Shepherd. I am the bread of life. I am the living water. I am all these kinds of things. Every time we hear that, that's a revelation of who he is. It's the same I am that talked to Moses. And so that's what's at the point here. Jesus has now revealed to us, in rather an odd place, but we'll take what we can get. Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And that's why we don't have to be afraid, because of who it is. This is God. This is not just some person with magical ability to walk on water. So that's the first part of the story. And the purpose of that story was to reveal Jesus as God, and once again to show the water, the walking, the church, and all of that. Now comes an interesting second part. Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you." Now that's an if clause. If clause usually are contrary to fact. If it is you is a backhanded way of saying it really isn't you. If it is you, command me to come to you and walk on the water. So this is Peter's way of saying, prove yourself. If you're really somebody, if you are the I am, then just tell me to come out and walk on that water with you. Jesus said, "Come on." So Peter got out of the boat, and started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand, caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" That's a good question. So what do you think the point of this story is? Well, people say the reason Peter started to sink was he lost his vision. He lost his concentration. As long as he was looking at Jesus there on the water, he was all right. But it's when whatever came along and his vision switched, as soon as he lost sight, he started to sink. Jesus pulled him back up. I don't think Matthew would agree with that interpretation, although you find that in most of the commentaries. I think the real point of the story, and remember the one we just read earlier about Jesus being in the boat, and the boat will not sink as long as he's in there, and that's why he can sleep, do whatever he wants to do, we're safe. You take that understanding and you apply it to this story, and you have to tell Peter, here's the problem that you ran into. You should have never gotten out of the boat. Who ever told you you were going to walk on water? Where did you get the impression that was going to extend to you? Who do you think you are? You of little faith, and you think you can come out here and be me. Well, you can't. And remember what I taught you earlier, which you did not remember. Why didn't we sink when we were in that storm earlier? Because I was in the boat. And now, what are you doing? Where am I? As long as I'm in the boat, you're safe. When you get out of the boat, that's when it's going to be bad. And what Matthew wants his Christians to know is, remember, this is in time of distress. And in time of distress is when people bail out. You've noticed that in almost all churches. They're telling us the same thing. Church attendance is down. What church is supposed to be about, all that sort of stuff. We've all heard that sort of thing, And so, because we can't figure it all out, people are just leaving. Leaving for what? Well, we don't know. All kinds of different things. But what Matthew would say, Matthew's advice to us would be, make sure you stay in the boat. It's going to be tempting because everybody else will tell you the boat is sinking. You get out of there right now while you can and walk on the water, swim, do whatever it takes to get out. And that's bad advice. That's bad advice for us, for anybody. Stay in the boat. So Matthew advises us. We've heard a lot about this so-called faith business. What is faith, you suppose? Peter is ridiculed several times because he apparently doesn't have enough. And Jesus in Matthew's gospel is fond of referring to the disciples as little believers, you of little faith. At other times he seems to indicate, well, little is better than none. You can still do a lot even if you have a little. Many people think faith is sort of like a collection of beliefs. When you say keep the faith, what does that generally mean? Well, I mean keep all whatever regulations, the rules and stuff we have. They equate faith with doctrine. To know the Catholic faith is to know all the intricacies of Catholic doctrine. Well, there's nobody in the world who knows all that. So that's probably not what that means. If you study the New Testament carefully, where references to faith and examples of faith are manifested, I think, anyway, so you don't have to think this, there are 4 aspects going on when we talk about faith, when the New Testament talks about faith. These are qualities that you have to have in order to have faith. The fewer of these you have, the littler is your faith. One is you have to be bold. Faith requires boldness because faith does not follow the dictates of logic. Faith is being bold. People in the New Testament, and especially in some of these stories, Matthew tells us, and in the stories Jesus said, we get lots of examples of people who were bold. Remember that woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years, and she just had run out of all her supplies. All the doctors had taken all of her money. She had nothing. She thought she had one last chance. Somehow or other, she believed Jesus had healing power. and he was going through a crowd, and she knew, if I touch him, because I'm impure, I've been bleeding for 12 years, that makes me ritually impure. If I touch anybody else, they're impure. The law said if somebody consciously impure goes and touches another person, they can be stoned for that. That is against the law. She has no idea what Jesus might do if she went up and touched his cloak, but she is convinced, if I can touch just the cloak of his garment, or the hem of that cloak, I'll be healed. And she does it. And then she doesn't know what's going to happen, because Jesus immediately knows that power has gone out of him. He starts looking around. Of course, he asks his disciples, and they say, "You got to be nuts. There are 1 million people. How are you going to figure? Who know? Everybody touched you. We don't know." But the woman knows. And so she's even going, there was a bold move to touch that, first of all. Now she's going to be even bolder. She's going to tell him she did it. Not knowing what he will. He could respond in any way. But she's going to tell him. And she told him. And then she kind of stood back and waited for the blast to come, which never did come, because he said, "Your faith has healed you." Calls her daughter, term of endearment, term of intimacy. Boldness. You'll find that present in a good number of these stories, healing stories especially. This is part of what is an ingredient of faith. But that's not all. People who are bold also have to have confidence in their faith. Confidence meaning that this faith is real. This is not imaginary. This is not something I just carry around in my mind, but it has no real reality to it. No, I believe it has a lot of reality to it. So much so that I am confident that if I put it into practice, it will work, like that woman. Like that woman. Remember that story of the Canaanite woman we talked about earlier? Terrific faith. After he insults her, point blank insults her, and she says, "I'm not leaving. You're not getting rid of me that way until I get what I want. Now let's get with it." And he's going, "We're with it. What do you want?" "I want my daughter cured now." Okay. Boldness and confidence she could get it done. Confidence she could get it done. And if you have boldness and you have confidence, that leads to a third quality, empowerment. Faith can be dangerous because faith also entails being empowered. Those with a little faith just have a little empowerment. But those who have lots of faith, think what that must be like. So, faith includes boldness, confidence, empowerment, and then finally, wrap it all up, transformation. It's another way of saying faith changes you. Faith is not just an idea. Faith is not just a concept. Faith is a reality that brings about change, transformation. So when people are talking about faith in the New Testament, when Jesus is talking about faith, and when he tells people, as he oftentimes does, sometimes, when he comes and does a healing or what, he doesn't touch the person at all. He doesn't go through any incantation. He just is standing out the side, and he'll simply say, "Your faith has healed you. Go in peace." Well, what is he talking about? He's talking about these elements. Remember that woman in Luke's gospel who went into that dinner party? Jesus was there eating because he'll eat with anybody. He doesn't care. So he's there at this formal dinner party, and all of a sudden they look up and here's this woman with her hair hanging down, which is generally a sign of a prostitute. And she looks around and she knows where he is, and she goes right over there, and we're all looking. And this floozy, where did she come from? How does she know him? And we made all kinds of conclusions about that too. And then we just watch the whole thing disintegrate. And then we watch Jesus, and you know what he does through the whole process? Nothing. Nothing. The woman does everything. She turns that whole dinner upside down. She goes right over to where he is, starts crying, starts having her tears drop on his feet, takes that hair that ought never have been hanging down, wipes the feet she should never touch in public. And we're all sitting there in apoplexy. And Jesus is laying there like a log, probably taking it all in, having a good time. Why? Look at these people. Boy, they're really upset, you know. And then finally, he turns the tide by telling the guy who threw the dinner party, Simon, that all the gestures of hospitality were not present when Jesus entered by Simon's people. But this woman performed all the letters of all the issues of hospitality. And rather than say anything more than that, he just looks at her and says, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." So think about that whenever you're hearing these things about faith. Boldness, confidence, empowerment, transformation. Deepen your faith. Very important advice from Matthew. Grow in love. This is the fourth one. Chapter 22, verse 34. This is a small one, actually. So small, I can't find it. All right, chapter 22, 34. When the Pharisees, these of course are generally, the Pharisees are the religious leaders of Judaism at the time of Jesus. They're his number one opponents, and they're certainly the number one opponents of Matthew. When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, Sadducees were an elite religious party of priests. They were very conservative. They didn't believe much of anything in the oral tradition. They believed most of the Pentateuch. They had no use for the prophets. And we just hang on. They do not believe in the concept of a resurrection from the dead. And right before this story we're going to read here, the Sadducees had gone after Jesus, and they've gone after the understanding of what it means to have resurrection from the dead. And they concocted this story about a woman who had so many husbands, and they all died, leaving her with no heir. Whose husband and wife will she be when she gets into wherever it is she's going to go? And they thought they had him all nailed down, but he really just kind of blows them away. And so that has just happened. And so when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. Now, they probably liked that because they didn't like the Sadducees either. So they probably got a kick out of that. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Now we hear that quite often in these stories, that there are stories to test Jesus. And a testing, what that really means is we're looking for ways to publicly embarrass him. We're looking for ways to show publicly by crisscrossing him up, by making him say one thing when he means to say another, by giving him an impossible situation that no one could get out of and watch him flounder. and anything to degrade who he is and what he says. And he always wins. You would think they learn, but they don't. He always wins. He is a master at surviving these tests. And then he, oftentimes, will turn the table on them. And they're miserable failures. They don't do anything. So this guy's not legitimate, really. I mean, he's out to embarrass publicly some way, shame Jesus. Teacher, he said, which commandment in the law is the greatest? Well, now remember, there are varieties of commandments. There are the 10 Commandments. We're all familiar with that. Judaism, however, believed that in addition to these 10 Commandments, while Moses was up there on the mountain, and you know he was up there a long time, they had time to get some business done, God gave Moses 613 additional laws. You can find those. They're not in the Bible, of course. They're in a document called the Mishnah. The Mishnah, which was written really after these Gospels were. But finally, the laws of the Mishnah were put together in a big book. And then when the rabbis would study the Torah, they would study individually each one of these 613 laws. Sometimes they would write down their reflections on each one. When you put the Mishnah together with the commentary that the rabbis would give to the Mishnah, these two things together became what we call the Talmud. And the Talmud became the very basic source for rabbinic theology. When you were a rabbi and you went to the synagogue to study, you studied most of the time, you studied the Talmud. So it was very common among rabbis, and legitimately so, to ask around, well, what do you think is the most important? Well, I think blah, 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 blah. Well, I don't know. I think, and it would be legitimate. That would go on. Nothing wrong with that. They would not have to agree. But you could gain insights by listening to what the other one had to say. So, teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? He said to them, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. Then they thought he was going to stop. And then they would come back and argue about that. But they think that's all he's going to say, but it isn't. While he just said that, then he goes on. And the second. They didn't hear about a second. They only asked about the first. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. We don't know how they responded. We don't hear anything. They must have walked away. They were defeated. They didn't know what to think or what to expect. The uniqueness here, so the commentators will tell us, is that Jesus makes an addition. All the rabbis would have agreed with him about the first commandment. That this is the greatest and the first commandment. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. You find that interspersed throughout the book of Deuteronomy. Every Jew would know that. Every Jew would agree. Yes, that's the greatest. Jesus makes an addition to the greatest. And that addition is what here he calls the second. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. So you put all those together. Love the Lord your God, all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Remember, Matthew's telling us this is why Jesus came, to show how to fulfill the law and the prophets. And here's a major teaching. How do you fulfill the law and the prophets, the fullness of divine revelation? How do you fulfill that? Well, he just told us. You fulfill that loving the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. If you can do that, you're home free. Which sounds easy, doesn't it? But we're not dumb. We know it's really not that easy. Grow in love. The fifth piece of advice that Matthew's going to give us, interesting little thing, become like children. Become like children. Matthew 18, verses 1 to 4. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Well, there are all kinds of theories on this, too. This would be another one of those questions the rabbis would like to sit around and chew on, assuming that there are people there in heaven. Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Remember, the kingdom of heaven is our ultimate goal. Blessed are you who are poor in spirit, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. Okay? What goes on there? Who is the greatest? Now, we would normally think a discussion about this would focus on great saints or heroes of us, We got plenty of them. Elijah, Moses, Abraham, Isaiah, Jeremiah. We could just go on and on. These are great people. These are our communion of saints. And certainly Jesus will pick one. It'll be interesting to see who he picks. Some say he was really fond of Jeremiah, Yeah, but I don't know. There's some others. Here's what he says, what he does. He called a child whom he put among them. So this is a visual aid. They ask him about who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. He finds a little child, puts it right there in their midst where everybody can see. And he said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." This is the passage that the church uses to talk about guardian angels, because these little kids apparently had guardian angels. So what would have been the impression here? Well, everybody knows, we don't necessarily, but they do. Whenever you're talking about a child, one of the things you have to remember is a child had no rights. If you looked at the social ladder, the dynamic of the social ladder, how it worked, who was on the bottom, who was on the top, and so forth, we would expect, when we talk about who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, we would have expected picking people from way up here at the top. That's not what he said. The greatest are the least. And that's what he's going to be telling you. If you want to be first, be last. Stuff that doesn't make any sense for it. We are told always, if you want to be first, get out there and be first. Beat the other person, number one. Everybody number one. But that's not what Jesus says, no. You have to become like a child. That doesn't mean be childish. That doesn't mean be innocent and going back to the early days before we were contaminated by the world and everything else. No, that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about fundamental values. Little children were the lowest on the level of social dynamics. They were way down here. We don't want to be way down. We want to be way up here. So what are you supposed to do? Well, Matthew's advice is you got to become like children. You have to become nothings. You have to become like nothings. Now you can imagine what the rabbis thought, what the Pharisees would have thought, what the Sadducees would have thought. This is going to be a teaching that Jesus will bring up again in the Passion narrative when he's talking about where he's headed for his ultimate encounter, which will be on the cross. But you have to slowly give away everything. Our value system has to change. We think everything is based on the greatest, being the first, being number one. If you want to be in the kingdom of heaven, you go in the opposite direction. Now we've known that because we knew when he started talking about this kingdom of heaven, and we knew when he started telling us about these who's blessed and who isn't. We got a little nervous when we heard that because he started to go in that direction. He didn't go real quick, but we could see this is not going the direction we want. We want to know how to be great. We want to know how to get into. We want to know how to be valuable. We want to, and more and more and more. And he comes along and he says, no, that's not the dynamic. The dynamic is learning how to become less. Well, how do you do that when you live in a culture that says just the opposite? And Matthew would say, it's very difficult. It's very difficult. You have to be convinced that this is true. How are you going to be convinced? Well, once again, Matthew would say, you really have to have the kind of faith that helps you do that. You have to have that kind of faith that allows you to be bold, to have confidence, to be empowered, and to be transformed. If you don't have that, it's going to be really tough. So that's the advice Matthew gives us today. Deepen your faith, grow in love, become like children. Those passages are all worth looking at, again, reading over, and of course this time asking yourself, where are you in all this? Just look at those dynamics of faith. Where are you with the dynamics of faith? Is your faith bold, confident, empowered, transforming? Or is it little faith? Matthew will say little faith is better than none, but will little faith be enough? He seems to urge us on to something greater. What does it take to have faith? That's a good question. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit,